Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar of tips on accurate reporting. I'm Lance French. I'm the marketing manager for W&M. Heather Woodward is our guest speaker today. Heather, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Lance.
Great. A few housekeeping items. We want you to be as interactive as much as possible. We will launch some poll questions throughout the webinar. If you have a specific question, use your question tab button on your GoToMeeting tab, and that will make sure that Heather sees it. If by chance we don't get to that question right away, I will make sure Heather sees it and gives you an answer sometime today. Heather, I know this is one of our most popular webinars throughout the year, so I don't want to delay anymore. So with that, take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lance. So we'll go ahead and get started on the presentation on just some tips that we've seen over the years in environmental reporting. I've been doing this for a lot of years and 10 years as a consultant. So I'm going to try to cover, it's going to be a very high-level presentation because as you can see from this agenda, I'm covering all the major regulatory reports, the Annual Waste Summary, the Tier 2s, stormwater reports, the Air Emissions Inventory, TRI, and the Pollution Prevention Annual Progress Report. So because I'm covering so many things in an hour, I'm not going to be able to delve down into details, but if you have like a detailed facility question, feel free to my contact information will be on the slides at the end. You can always feel free to email me later and we will maybe talk through some more site-specific details. But with that, if you have questions, go ahead and submit them also via the tab, and we can talk to them too, especially if they're more generic or general type questions. I should be able to respond to them. So I'm going to have in here embedded throughout this a bunch of different tips, and you'll see these tips repeated over and over again, and that is don't be late. You need to know what your due dates are and start early. We have lots of clients that come to us in the last week saying, hey, oh no, it's the end of the month and I need to have this done by March 1st. Can you guys do it? So typically, yes, we can, and we'll work on it and jump through hoops, but sometimes it just may not be doable to get it done. So make sure you start early, know when your dates are, and give yourself plenty of lead time to get it done. Whether you do it in-house or whether you hire a consultant to help you with that, make sure you give yourselves lots of lead time to get it done. So with that said, I think most people know the due dates. I actually tend to forget them, so we have a magnet that we have that has all these due dates that you can post on your file cabinet or whatever. And if you want a magnet, feel free to ask for one and we'll get you a magnet. March 1st is probably the biggest due date coming up with the Annual Waste Summary and the Tier 2s. And then hot on the heels of that are the Stormwater Benchmark and Discharge Monitoring Reports requirements and the Air Emissions Inventory. And then just when you start thinking you can breathe again, it's TRI season. And those, the Air Emissions Inventory reports and the TRIs are the two really complex reports that take a lot of time to prepare. And then there's the Annual Progress Report for Pollution Prevention, also due July 1st. So we'll jump in, and I'm going to go through kind of, like I said, some high-level stuff on reporting tips, things that we see that are common mistakes. And the first tip, and it's the tip for every one of these reports, is do you even have to report? You should really know for sure whether the report is applicable to you and your operations. So for the Annual Waste Summary, you report if you're a small quantity or a large quantity generator, and by that means you generate enough hazardous waste to trigger small quantity or large quantity generator. In Texas, you also have to do the Annual Waste Summary report if you're a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, but you generate more than 2,000 pounds of Class 1 non-hazardous waste. And then there's some storage criteria that can trigger it as well. But those are the two most common triggers is the actual generation amounts. If in some cases you may have a no report required annual waste summary, which seems like an oxymoron, but If you only generated 220 pounds of hazardous waste in a calendar month, you were conditionally exempt small quantity generator, but don't meet any of the other criteria, you can possibly do this no report required, or you're conditionally exempt small quantity generator, but you had 220 pounds of the class 1 non-hazardous waste in a month. And if you recycled all that class 1, then you don't have to report. But you actually have to turn in a report that checks the box that says, I didn't have to report. I know it seems kind of squirrely, but that is one of the things that you may trigger. What we find, generally speaking, I like using the annual prep file, which is where you basically go in manifest by manifest and enter your shipments. I think it's a really good tool. I know some people, you do have the option of skipping the annual prep file and going straight into preparing your annual waste summary via Steers. And again, this is all via Steers. But especially if you have lots of waste streams and lots of shipments, the annual prep file really helps. And one of the big things there is you need to make sure you know what your system type codes are, because that's a line item in the waste summary, and it's on line 19 of your manifest. And just make sure your TSDFs are entering that. So when you get your returned copy from your TSDF, that you've looked to see, make sure they've populated that. Some TSDFs are really good about it, and some kind of miss it. So make sure you have that. And also those H codes are relevant when you're reporting on your TRI potentially. So it does double duty. You need to make sure that you include your end of the year inventory, and that includes satellite accumulation areas. And one of the things that I found out just recently, I was reading through the regs on something else and happened to notice that an end of the year inventory is actually required in Texas code, that you actually go through and do an inventory of your waste on site at the end of each year. And I'll go into a formula here in a few minutes that explains how that information is used in the annual waste summary. So again, you may also have brokers that give you annual waste summaries for what they've hauled off site for you, and some of those can be really great helps, especially when you're looking at weights and total weights in the year and you're trying to do some cross-reference. So some of your waste brokers will have that information for you, but again, you need to double check that data and make sure it's correct. And you may have multiple waste brokers, or make sure that you're including all the waste streams that you generate depending on how it's shipped out. So make sure you gather all your right data. Some things that you don't report are like used oil and oil filters if they're being recycled. And again, if you have a lot of manifests through the year, you can actually do your annual prep file throughout the year. So at the end of every month, maybe you sit down for a few hours, an hour, and data enter the stuff into the annual prep file every month, so that it doesn't get to be middle of February and you've got 1,000 manifests to enter, or some other way of trying to track your annual waste generation. Some common mistakes is not entering the waste that was stored on site at the end of the year, or messing up the total quantity generated formula. So when you do your annual prep file and then you say, hey, I want to generate my annual waste summary report, you'll notice that the total quantity generated field is empty and it hasn't been populated. And a lot of people go, why don't they just copy in the amount I shipped goes right into my total quantity generator, right? The answer to that is no. The formula is actually total quantity generated, the amount shipped during the report year, and what you shipped off site gets reported, but your total quantity generated is actually the amount you shipped off site plus anything you had stored on site at the end of the year, which is a required inventory thing, minus the amount stored on site the prior year. And you can get that information off the prior year's annual waste summary. And that's the formula for total quantity generated. And that's a common mistake that we see with a lot of clients, is they don't realize that they can't just assume that the amount they shipped is the amount they generated in that year. And again, the amount stored on site includes your satellite accumulation areas. The other thing is the amount stored on site at the end of the year in a waste management unit has to be a line item on your annual waste summary. So it's not going to be created by your annual prep file because it's not coming from a manifest. So when you're in that final stage of preparing your actual annual waste summary after you've imported your prep file, you can go back in and manually enter, I had 1,000 pounds of this waste stream at WMU 001, and it was stored. It would be H141 for storage, or whatever the code would be. So that's another mistake we commonly see, is that people don't enter that data stored on site at the end of the year into their annual waste summary. A nice way to avoid that problem, and I've got quite a few clients that do this, which is they ship out at the end of every year. They get rid of everything that they have on site and start with a clean slate every year. So that's an option. For Class 1 non-hazardous waste, you don't include any portion that has been recycled in your total quantity generated, but you do include anything that's, say, sitting in storage at the end of the year or waiting to be recycled. So those are some key things with non-hazardous waste. So this gets to the next tip, which is read the instructions. TCQ has great reg guidance out there that you can look at, read through, read the instructions. Even if you've been doing them for a long time, it helps to refresh your memory of what the rules are. And also, if you've been doing them for a long time, it's like, oh, I've been doing this for 10 years. Well, maybe things changed in the last 10 years, and you weren't keeping up with it because you weren't reading the instructions. So go back through and make sure you read the instructions. So that is the end of the annual waste section. So if there are any questions, we'll take them. And I think Lance will be launching a poll question now.
Yeah, Heather, I do have a question from Don. He said, will this presentation be available on a PDF download? And the answer to that is going to be yes. As soon as we get it downloaded, we'll either make it available on our website or I will send you the link. Another question from Mike is, if I have a major reduction in haz waste generated, would a verbal explanation describing changes to our processes equipment be a good idea?
I think having that information on site is a good idea to put in your records in case you're ever inspected, but you don't necessarily need to submit any of that to the TCEQ. Just make sure it's on site and handy in case an inspector ever shows up.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll question in 10 seconds.
And also to answer that question, you will get these slides, and all these web links are embedded in the slides, so you'll be able to click on all these links that I've put in. And I put in lots of reference links for you guys to click on.
And Heather, I just launched the answer results, the poll results.
Okay, I'm not seeing them. Am I supposed to punch something?
Well, you should be, but I will go ahead and give you the answers. It's 73% said yes, and then 27% say no, that they did not know that they were supposed to report waste stored on site at the end of the year.
Okay, good. So a few people learned at least one new thing this webinar. Hopefully we'll keep that trend going. Okay, so moving on to Tier 2s. These are right around the corner with March 1st, right along with your annual waste summary. So again, tip 3, which is the first tip for any of these reports, is do I have to report? So you report if you have more than 10,000 pounds of a hazardous chemical, or you have more than the threshold planning quantity or 500 pounds of an extremely hazardous substance. And you'll see that this EHS is a hot link. So that's a link off to the list of what the extremely hazardous substances are, so you can see what your TPQ is for those. And you report if you have that amount exceed one of these 2 triggers on site for any one day during the report year. So, I mean, if you just had it on for one day and then it left, you're technically supposed to report that on your Tier 2, even if it's not on your site. And again, let's say you had something on your site for the first 6 months and you shut down that operation or discontinued that chemical, and for whatever reason you don't have it anymore, you still would have to report that it was there during that 6 months. And then there's a section in the report that talks about days on site. So your days on site may only be 1 day or 180 days, but you still have to report it even if it was on site for 1 year or 1 day during that report year. And I've got the link in here on what a hazardous chemical is. But it kind of falls into the exemptions. There's quite a number of exemptions. The most common ones that we find people use are if the material safety data sheet clearly comes out and says it's not a hazardous chemical or it's not reportable under these sections. Just make sure that you believe your MSDS, because sometimes they are not prepared properly or by somebody that understands rules. But in general, if your SDS says it's not a hazardous chemical under OSHA, then you don't have to report on whatever that is. Just make sure that if you're not reporting on something, that you have that documentation in your files to justify and back up your I didn't report because it wasn't a hazardous chemical stance. So make sure you have that documented. I'm always harping on clients, we've got to document the negatives. Just because an inspector will walk in and say, why didn't you report that? And you go, I didn't have to. Well, if you have the paperwork in your files proving it and thought it through, they'll be like, oh, okay, that works. But if you just kind of look at them and go, well, we never have before, that answer doesn't fly. So just make sure you always document when you are any of these exemptions. You don't report hazardous or radioactive waste, and then there's an article exemption. So basically, if something is an article, its form or function is already determined by its shape, then you don't report on it. So something like, in a lot of cases, this would be things like raw metal stock. If it's already in its form and its shape and it's not really a hazard, then you can do it. But this doesn't include things like salt. Salt is actually a reportable chemical because it can be an irritant. So, and the article exemption also doesn't apply to something like lead acid batteries. They are not considered an article because they contain a liquid or gel that's a chemical. So they don't fall under that. There are lots of other exemptions, and here's the link to them, but these three are the most common exemptions that are out there that are used. So I think most everybody knows that the Tier 2 program moved to the TCEQ and moved out from under the Texas Department of State Health Services and is now regulated under TCEQ and managed under TCEQ. So the links for all the reference stuff has changed to TCEQ, and I've gone through and updated them in this presentation. Some of the key changes that took place with this is, one is the TCEQ eventually plans on moving the reporting up under STEERS, but for this year, continue to use the Tier 2 submit software. The NAICS codes have changed, so when you're uploading your last year's Tier 2 into this year's Tier 2 submit software, double check and make sure that that NAICS code is correct. They've, as kind of a side effect of the whole West explosion thing, ammonium nitrate is now got much shorter time frame for when you need to report. So if you have ammonium nitrate, make sure you're making sure that that's notified to the TCEQ and your local emergency planning commission and your fire department within 72 hours of moving it on site. And then the TCEQ will start doing the inspections. The other big key thing here that we have is the submit. You submit your Tier 2 software report. It's an actual electronic file, and you submit that to the TCEQ to this web address that's linked here below. in the past, you did the same thing. You would upload your Tier 2 submit report file onto an email and email that into the Texas Department of State Health Services, and they would email back a confirmation, yeah, I got your report. And so you would get a confirmation email back from them. From what I understand, the TCQ is not doing that confirmation automatic confirmation of receipt. So make sure that when you hit your submit, you go in and do a read receipt through your emailing tool. Key information that you're going to need, obviously, are going to be your SDSs and knowing your chemical inventory and the big amounts that you store, or the SDS, making sure you trigger which ones are extremely hazardous substances. TXT2 numbers, I think that is mainly a financial issue, but each company as a whole, as an umbrella, will have the TXT2 numbers, and you use one corporate number, and then each site will submit their own reports, and you can have consolidated filing fees under one TXT2 number. You email it to the TCQ, we already talked about that, and you would, depending on your local emergency planning commission or committee and your local fire departments, the way they want to see this data can change. I think most LEPCs want to see both the software file, the Texas Tier 2 software file, and the PDF. And the local fire department, you just need to call them and see how they want it. Some fire departments are fine with emailing the software file. Others want to see the PDF, the paper copies. So just make sure you contact each one. When you are mailing paper copies, as always, whenever you mail something, make sure it's certified mail so that you have confirmation that you sent it out. Again, common mistake we see is that most people don't realize that lead-acid batteries count. And the places that they don't even think about is things like forklifts, especially if you have electric forklifts. Those batteries are really heavy, and then they contain a fair amount of sulfuric acid, and sulfuric acid has a 500-pound reporting threshold, so it doesn't take more than maybe 2 or 3 forklifts to trigger that if they're electric forklifts. Also, a lot of places will have UPSs, uninterrupted power systems, for backups, especially for like data centers. And so make sure that you've looked to see if you have any closets with huge battery strings that are being used. So here's some resources. I'm not going to read through these, but the hot links, when you get the slides, you can link to all these different sources. They're all really good. So questions and polls.
Okay, I just launched the poll, Heather. We do have one question from the last section. Cindy asked, how do we report Class 1 wastewater that is sent to a POTW, and how do we quantify it?
On the Tier 2 or on the Annual Waste Summary?
It doesn't say.
Can you clarify that?
It doesn't say. I tell you what we'll do is we'll come back to that. We'll address. I'll email her and we'll address that. Another question came from Mike. It says, I use 17% of batter weight as a calculation for reporting acid. Is that accurate?
The battery acid weight, 17% is a good rule of thumb. I think the TCQ's guidance documents that I've seen is 18%, but that's a very conservative, high estimate. If you can get the actual battery information from the battery manufacturer and use the SDS or some tech sheet that will say, I've got so much electrolyte in my battery, and of that electrolyte, a certain percentage is sulfuric acid, and actually do the math out, you probably would actually have a lower rate. But as a rule of thumb, 18% is what the TCQ typically uses. But again, that's a very conservative estimate based on our experience in actually looking at battery data.
And we do have a clarification on this on the question before, so I'll go ahead and reread the question. How do we report Class 1 wastewater that is sent to a POTW, and how do we quantify it on the annual waste summary?
Okay, so if it's Class 1 wastewater, I assume that you were storing it on site for some period of time in a waste management unit. But ultimately, if it's a Class 1 wastewater and you're discharging it, most of those wastes are excluded from the RCRA rules. So if it's just a wastewater going to a POTW, I don't think you'd have to report it unless you are putting it in a different waste management unit. Or you're running it through a waste management unit on your site, in which case you would report it as being treated through, say you have a wastewater treatment plant as a WMU, then you would report it as being treated in that WMU. Hopefully that answers your questions. If not, maybe you can email me or call me and we can talk through your specific scenario, but it depends. If you are sending that Class 1 wastewater into a waste management unit, then you would report it there as being treated.
If we have time for one more question, Forrest asked, how do you determine the amount of lead versus sulfuric acid when figuring your numbers for forklift batteries?
Again, you would look at the lead, but the lead is not reportable in and of itself because the lead is not an extremely hazardous substance. So it's got a 10,000 pound reporting threshold. But again, you would have to look back at your battery SDSs to see how much lead is actually in the battery itself. I don't know of a rule of thumb amount of lead in a battery like there is for the sulfuric acid because, again, typically it's the sulfuric acid that's the trigger because of the 500 pound reporting threshold, not the lead.
Okay, and I'm going to announce the quick poll results. Do you think that Tier 2 reports are actually used by the emergency planning authorities? And 85% said yes, and 15% said no. Okay. Thoughts on that, Heather?
That's interesting. I mean, again, that's probably about what I would say. I think really the important thing is to make sure your fire departments know about it, because ultimately, if you have a fire at your facility, they're the ones that are going to be coming out and responding. So I think the fire departments in particular will use them. Okay, we'll move on to stormwater. This one's relatively short. It's only a couple of slides. Again, same question, do I have to report? And if you have a current multi-sector general permit, TXR 050,000 stormwater permit, and you have sector-specific benchmarks, or you have sector-specific numeric effluent limits, like the hazardous metal is a numeric effluent limit, then you have to do either a benchmark and or a DMR. So, if you have not waived your annual hazardous metal monitoring requirement, and there are several different scenarios where you can waive that monitoring requirement, but if you haven't, then you would have to do the discharge monitoring report for the samples you collected in that year. If you, and then depending on your sector, you may also have benchmark requirements. If you have benchmark requirements, you have to submit your report by March 31st to the TCEQ. Even if you didn't collect samples for whatever reason, either you didn't have discharge at your outfalls or you didn't happen to collect a sample, you still have to submit your report by March 31st of every year. So make sure you're doing that. And I'd say that if you have, and you submit a report that says no discharge or no sample, that you make sure that you've been adequately documenting why you didn't have discharge at that. So like maybe making notes on your rain gauge log. Yeah, I had rain, but it wasn't enough to reach my outfall, that sort of thing, because you'll have to be able to document why you didn't collect a sample if you didn't get one. That is also for your quarterly visual monitorings, which I'm not really talking about here, but you need to make sure you have the same documentation if you're not collecting those samples too. The discharge monitoring report is actually based on an effluent limit. So the benchmarks, if you're not reaching your benchmarks, there's no legal requirement that says you've had a violation if you don't meet your benchmark. But the discharge monitoring report is actually a permit discharge limit. And that's why you have to, if you are doing the annual metals discharge monitoring report, you only submit it if you had a violation. So let's say you've got a limit of 1 milligrams per liter and you busted that limit, then you would need to submit it to the TCEQ. Otherwise, you just show that all my hazardous metals were below the permit limit and leave it and have it signed. Make sure you get your signatory authority person to sign that discharge monitoring report and keep it in your files with your SWIP. So make sure you have that completed by March 31st and in your SWIP. And now if you're in one of these other sectors, then you have to submit it to the TCEQ regardless of whether or not you exceeded a discharge limit by March 31st. Things that you're going to need to collect it, obviously, is any analytical reports, and then any site-specific reports. Like some of them, like in some cases, you may have the requirement to collect your pH at your facility. You do that yourself because you have to have it analyzed within the 15-minute window. So you're going to do on-site your own pH stuff. So make sure you have that documented and in your files. You have to keep these on site for at least 3 years. And another reporting tip, something that you have, is that your benchmark results are averaged across all outfalls on the form. And so it's the benchmark average is the average of the first half and the second half. So it's not the individual result. Similarly, the discharge monitoring report is also submitted on a site-wide basis. It is not on an outfall by outfall basis. So when you're completing your discharge monitoring report, make sure it's just one report for the whole year. Again, read the reporting instructions. The benchmark report has the instructions on the back side of it. And then I've got a link coming up to discharge monitoring report instructions. Make sure you have your units right. Here's some resources. Again, going back to one of the things that we commonly see, again, over and over again, is the discharge monitoring report is not completed for each outfall. So let's say you have copper as one of your benchmark criteria, and it is also a hazardous metal. So, and you have 4 outfalls. So you're going to wind up with 2 copper samples at each outfall for the year, because you're going to have one for the first half and one for the second half benchmark, and those actually apply towards your hazardous metal monitoring. So you'll actually wind up with 8 copper results. So in completing your discharge monitoring report, you would pick the highest copper amount through the calendar year of those 8 results. You pick the highest, and that's what you report in your form. And then there's a spot that says frequency of analysis, and that frequency number would be 8, because you collected 8 copper samples, but you report only the highest one. And then hopefully the column, the spot that says number of violations or exceedances is 0, but it could be anywhere from 0 to 8, depending on whether or not you busted a copper limit anywhere along the line. So we see that quite a bit. Is a lot of people trying to say, oh, I'm doing a DMR for outfall 1 and then another one for outfall 2, and that's not how that works. Again, a lot of great resources that are available. And then the discharge, the DMR instructions are actually from 1999 because it was hard to find the instructions. They've kind of disappeared, but they're still applicable. Also, I think everybody knows this, but in case you don't, the MSGP, the current multi-sector general permit, is expiring August 14th, 2016. That's a great date. That's my birthday. And the proposed MSGP and fact sheets are out on the website now. So if you haven't had the pleasure of downloading and reading through the new multi-sector general permit to see how it's going to affect you, go out there and download it. The comment period is finished, so they're in the processes of responding to comments and finalizing that permit, and it will come out and hopefully launch August 14th, and then you will need to update your stormwater plan in accordance with that and renew your permit. So I think,
Heather, I do have a question. Yeah, I'm sorry, I do have a question. If I have two outfalls at my site, how many DMRs do I have to submit?
the answer to that is one DMR. Just one DMR. Okay. The emissions inventory is the next topic, and I will be cruising through this relatively quickly, certainly quickly compared to the complexity of the emissions inventory report. It's a very complex report. Actually, to me, the reporting instructions for it aren't that complex, at least not compared to TRI, but the complexity of the emissions calculations at each individual facility can be huge. I mean, some of these calculations are very, very complex and require a lot of backup software and stuff. So there are varying reporting criteria based on the geographic location of where you're at. So if you're in a non-attainment area, you're going to have stricter reporting criteria and need to trigger reporting sooner than if you're in an attainment area. So this table pretty much outlines it. And in some cases, the TCEQ can just say, hey, I want you to report. Lead in particular is one of the ones that gets asked for by the TCEQ. This is definitely one where tip 2 makes a big difference. You got to start early because these reports take a lot of time to prepare and to go through all the calculations and to gather all the data. And this is one, and I think everybody who has a complex EI knows this, is to start really the year before. If you haven't already got your data tracking and mechanisms in place, you really should have them in place now so that you have the data and can gather it for the report that's due March 31st for the previous report year. Things that you may need, and this is not a comprehensive list by any means, are things like SDSs or the vendor data. If you do stack testing or monitoring data, make sure you have that. Any production chemical usage and throughput data, you're going to need any of that information. All your specs on your various pieces of equipment that may affect your emissions calculations, you know, emissions factors, etc. Make sure you have all that information in place and gathered up. And like I said, generally speaking, you should have all this. If you're reporting in 2016, you should have really had all this data tracking going from January 1st of 2015. The complete emissions inventory includes the emission submission, the EI submission, and this year you're required to do it via SEERS. They're no longer accepting the paper submissions. So if you have not done it via SEERS prior to this, make sure you start now and getting set up and getting your responsible official who's going to sign it and authorize it set up in SEERS so that that whole infrastructure is in place. Because it can take some time to get all the signatures and all the SEERS accounts set up. So make sure that you've got all of that going if you haven't done it already. So no more paper. And so you'll submit, so you'll go through, you'll put all this stuff into STEERS, or it's already there, the infrastructure. You'll enter your new emissions inventory data into STEERS, and you'll submit it. And then there's a validation process. And once it's validated, then it's considered submitted. And then once the responsible official has submitted it and signed it. So you need to make sure all of those steps take place. Then you will upload data. They require sample calculations, and the TCEQ prefers those to be actually in the Excel format so that they can see the backup data. They have to know enough about your calculations to make sure that they concur with your calculation methodologies. So typically they want to see the Excel spreadsheet so they can see how you set up your calculations. And then any summary test results for your stack test data, any of your relative accuracy test audit sheets for your SIMs and PEMs, make sure you have those, make sure it's signed or certified, signed by the signed certification statement. Actually, that's going to be via STEERS this year. And if you have confidential information, don't submit that through the STEERS tool. So the STEERS tool will have the ability for you to upload any of this data. So your calculations can be uploaded. Any of this stack test data can all be uploaded via STEERS as part of completing your inventory. But again, your inventory isn't considered complete, and all this stuff has to be into STEERS and into the TCEQ by March 31st. So it's not like you can throw your emission submission over the wall at the TCEQ and say, good, I'm done, and then 2 weeks later get your sample calculations and stuff done. You need to have it all done and all submitted by the 31st. Confidential information, you actually still have to mail a hard copy in. Some of the things we've run across is making sure that your emissions inventory structure, which is your facility information, your emission point information, and if you have a pollution control device, make sure that pathway is accurately set up and identified, and make sure you do that before you hit the enter button or the submit button when you're finalizing it, because it can be really hard to modify that structure once it's in place. And the naming conventions, some can get changed, but it's really hard. So we accidentally had a stack that was STK exclamation point because somebody forgot to take their finger off the shift key. Instead of STK1, it was STK exclamation point, and it didn't get caught, and so then it wound up being in there forever, which is really kind of sad and embarrassing. But so just make sure that you have it right, and if in a lot of cases the structure is already in and you're just completing the information, but if you have new equipment or a new facility, make sure this part's done correctly, because it can save a lot of heartburn in the future making sure that's correct. You can do collective sources reporting. So if you have a bunch of small emissions but you still have to report them, make sure you can report them as a collective source. Just have to make sure that they have similar source classification codes and collectively do them. And then MSS, if it's an annual emissions routine MSS, you have to report those, but you don't include it an emissions event or in your annual emissions inventory, or non-authorized MSS. These are reported separately. So they've got their own columns. So I kind of mumbled through that. But again, this is one where reading the instructions and the guidance document every year would probably help, just to make sure you aren't missing anything. You speciate the data. You need to make sure, and this is a common mistake, is how to speciate and which contaminant code to pick, to make sure you know your geographic location, because your speciation criteria changes depending on where you're at geographically in the state, and you need to pick the right contaminant code. And then again, getting back to confidential information, it should all be sent in via certified mail, and you can't submit it or should not submit it via the STEERS portal or via email, because there's no way for the TCEQ to guarantee confidentiality if you submit via those methods. Make sure it's clearly marked, and emissions data can't be confidential. So make sure if you have confidential stuff that you're managing that properly. Ozone season emissions, basically you don't have to report it if you're west of the 100-degree longitude line unless you're in El Paso County. And then the ozone season formula, this changed within the past couple of years. So a lot of folks that have been doing this in a long time, go back and double check your spreadsheets and make sure that your ozone season emission calculations have the denominator of the 153 days is the denominator. A couple years ago, TCEQ just said make it a flat 153 days, and that's what your denominator is supposed to be from now on. So make sure that you've made that change. So again, I ran through air emission source very quickly compared to the complexity of the report. So if you have any questions, feel free to holler out at them.
Nothing so far. We're good.
Okay. Again, lots of resources and links. I would recommend downloading the RG360 and reading through it. So going on to another of the complex reports, more complex reports that get done, and that's the Toxics Release Inventory Report, or the TRI. And again, how do you know if you have to report? You have to be in a facility that's on the NAICS code. If you're a manufacturing facility, basically the TCEQ or the EPA, this is an EPA-driven report. If you're on the list of the NAICS codes, then you trigger potentially reporting. And if your facility has greater than or equal to 10 full-time employees. So once you pass those two, generally that's pretty easy. Yep, I'm in the NAICS code, and yep, I've got 50 employees. So those two are the quick and easy decision points. The next one is and then if you manufacture, process, or otherwise use a TRI reportable chemical, and there's over 600 in the list, above the threshold quantity, then you have to report. So the threshold for manufacturing and processing is 25,000 pounds, otherwise uses 10,000. And then there's a sub-list of the TRI chemical list, which are your persistent biocumulative toxins, things like lead and mercury and some of the pesticides. Packs fall into there, and typically the range is 10 to 100 pounds reporting threshold. That is where the electronics industry really gets hammered, is because lead is a 100-pound threshold, and if you use lead solder in your process, then you're going to have to report. So lead can be a trigger for a lot of people because it can be in a lot of different things. This is basically a visual of what I just talked about. So it's just the same thing. And again, you need to document. This is the next thing, and I kind of talked about it earlier, but document, document, document. Document everything. So if you don't exceed a threshold, make sure you document that you did not exceed it, because they're going to come back and say, how come you didn't report on lead or on your methanol use or whatever? And if you don't have the data and the calculations to back it up, then you're going to be in trouble. So again, the first step in all of this is the threshold determination. So the TRI reporting process is two distinct steps. The first one is, do I even have to report? And so you go through the calculations to see if you exceeded any of those reporting thresholds of 10,000, 25,000, or persistent PBT thresholds. If you exceeded that, then you go on to completing your Form R or your Form A, depending on your releases. But if you didn't, again, make sure you've documented adequately that you didn't exceed a threshold, and put that stuff in your files and do it every year. Don't just go, oh, I put stuff in my files last year, so I'm good. Every year you have to go back through those steps and those calculations to justify your not reporting. Then if you triggered something, then you have to go back and do your release determinations, and that's, you know, how much release to the air, how much release to water or stormwater, etc. So that's what you have to do. So again, here's a pictorial of that same process. Things that you're going to need are SDSs or vendor data on the chemical compositions of your chemicals, because you have to know if your chemical composition has a TRI reportable chemical. It's easiest to verify that by CAS number, but make sure you are also still looking at the chemical compounds as well, because the chemical compounds like a metal compound, copper compounds, lead compounds, glycol ethers, those things are grouped, so the CAS number is not going to trigger it necessarily. So make sure you look that way as well. And you're going to need to know how much was used. And again, this is based on actual usage. So if you have throughput data, actual production records, that's the best thing to use. In a lot of cases, companies don't track actual throughput or usage, but they do track how much they bought. So that's not necessarily as good, because maybe you bought more than you actually used that year, but that might be the best you have. So make sure you have accurate data to determine how much of this stuff you went through. So those are some things for threshold determination data. And then for reporting, the Form R or the Form A, you need to make sure you have your offsite transfers, manifest, or whatever other records. Maybe you send some stuff off for recycling, so it's not so much that you have a manifest, but you have either a bill of lading or a weight ticket from the receiver that's the scrap yard or whatever receiving the material. So whatever you have to show your offsite transfers, wastewater or stormwater discharge monitoring reports, so that you have your analyticals to, in case something's in your discharge, wastewater discharge. Again, your air emissions inventory. If you've already had to do your emissions inventory, you can use that data and plug that into your TRI. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And then if you've done any on-site disposal or recycling, you need to have that information. So whatever information you need. And again, this can be very different from chemical to chemical and from site to site. So some common reporting mistakes that we see, and again, this is one, read the instructions. And if any of you have ever downloaded the instructions, they're really long, but they're really useful. So I would recommend reading through them, especially the sections on the definitions of facility, manufacture, process, and otherwise use. And then also the sections on the exemptions, because there are a lot of exemptions out there that may help you not have to report. So the first thing is to identify the chemical, and then to see if you can possibly use that chemical in an exemption, like say maybe it's used in a laboratory, or it's in your facility grounds maintenance usage rather than in your production processes. So make sure that you know what these are, what your exemptions are. And I harp all the time on knowing definitions in general, because those definitions can trigger applicability or not for a lot of things, not just reporting, but just the applicability of a regulation by itself. So again, for example, the definition of a facility for TRI is different than the definition of a facility for SPCC or for air permitting or for RCRA waste management. So each program area may have the same term, but it may mean something completely different. So make sure you read the definition relative to whatever regulatory arena you're trying to evaluate applicability.
Hey, Heather, Ariel has a quick question. What is considered confidential information for EI reports?
That would be things like a specific recipe or formula that's a trade secret, things along those lines. Maybe some of your throughput data maybe could be considered that way, but it'd be a lot, especially formulations or things that you don't want your competitors to know? So hopefully that answers the question. If not, feel free to holler at me and I'll get you a more elaborate list. Also, the TCEQ emissions inventory. On this guidance document, one of the things I forgot to point out is that the emissions inventory workshop is a really good resource, but it happened already. It was last week, I believe. But you can find their slides at this link, and in those slides they have a list of confidential information and how to handle it and a lot of examples. So that's another resource if I haven't answered your question and you're looking at a specific piece of information and going, gee, is this confidential or not? You can look at these slides, or you can look at the RG guidance document and see if it covers it. And if push comes to shove and you just still aren't really sure you want concurrence, you can always talk to the TCEQ about it and verify whether or not they'll consider something confidential. Okay. Reporting tips and common mistakes. So again, some of the things that we really see, we do a lot of TRIs every year for a lot of different companies, and we go to the EPA's training program. EPA Region 6 has all-day training sessions that are free, and they're excellent. So if you do TRI reports, I would highly recommend you keep your eyes open. I looked yesterday, and they still haven't posted this year's training sessions, but they usually take place in April and May. And in a lot of cases, they email out reminders to people who have been previous filers as to when their classes are going to be, and they're throughout Region 6, so Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, lots of different locations. I highly recommend that you go to one of these because they cover a lot of really good material. The big thing is making sure you have really good records and documentation. I can't harp on that enough, especially for this program. And don't reinvent the wheel. If you have good records, you can use them in subsequent report years. Just make sure that whatever some assumptions you have are still valid. But definitely don't reinvent the wheel. But make sure that if you use, like, say, an emission factor in calculating an air emission, that you have documented where that emission factor came from, rather than just having it embedded in your spreadsheet. Somebody goes, well, what is this emission factor? Where did it come from? And you go, I don't know. Well, somebody determined it 10 years ago based on some, AP 42 or EPA guidance document. Make sure that that information carries over in your records year over year so that it doesn't fall off and get obsoleted or destroyed when you do a records purge. So make sure that old assumption data that you're using gets carried forward in your record keeping. Some of the other things that the TCEQ brings, or the EPA brings up in their training class, is the NA versus 0. So NA means that something is not possible. So if you cannot have that chemical in your wastewater, then the answer is NA. 0 means that it's possible, but no release occurred. So let's say it's possible I could have methanol in my wastewater, but it's not likely, or I've done the calculations and it's less than half a pound, then I can report 0. But there is a difference between an NA and a 0, so make sure that if you say NA, you really mean there is no possible way that that release could have occurred from my facility, as opposed to it could have occurred, but it's most likely not have occurred, and it's a 0. So that's a common thing that we see and that they talk about in their training class. And then also some data precision. This can really help you out, especially using the range codes that they have set up. If you have a non-PBT chemical, and we use the range codes because they're more forgiving. The range codes are like, the A range is I release 0 to 10 pounds from this facility of this chemical, or the B range is, I think, 11 to 50, and then the next one is 50 to like 500 or 100. I might have those range numbers wrong, But if you can put your emissions, your release, into one of those buckets, that way if you have a little bit of error in your methodology or your calculation, you're still going to be having reported accurately, even if your calculation might be slightly off. And then also round to 2 significant digits for non-PVTs, and that's another one that they talk about a lot in the EPA class. And make sure that whatever you're using as your rounding is relative to your accuracy. I mean, Excel can get you 10 decimal points, but if you're saying, well, I think it was about 10 pounds, and so your accuracy is like an order of magnitude of 10, then, you know, don't give them 10 decimal points. Just get to whatever, but you need to at least get to within 2 significant digits. So those are some key things that we see for TRI. And it looks like my time is actually up. I was just looking at that, Lance. Do you want to launch that last poll question?
Time does fly, that is for sure. So let's, yeah, let's get that last poll question up. And do you feel that you have adequately documented your threshold determination, even for non-reportable chemicals? So we'll let that people answer that really quick. And
while they're answering that, I just want to run through the annual progress report. It's only 2 slides. It's not a lot. This is if you have to do a pollution prevention plan, which is if you're a large quantity generator or a TRI reporter, you've had to prepare an annual pollution or a pollution prevention plan. So by July 1st of every year, you actually have to report on any waste or reductions you've had in either hazardous waste or TRI, and that's due. And basically, hopefully you've been implementing your P2 projects and you know what your metrics are, so then it's pretty easy to put it in to the system and you report via steers.
okay, I'll send here. I'm going to share the results from our last poll, and it says 56% said yes, 12% said no, and 32% said partially.
Okay, so some of you really feel like you're doing adequate documentation, and a few of you are like, yeah, I could do better, or way better. So good.
Okay.
And I think we have one more really critical poll question, right?
This is the one that I'm most excited about, the answers.
Yes.
So Super Bowl winners, the Broncos or the Panthers or the commercials? Ooh, oh, it was 50-50 for a minute.
Oh.
Okay, I'm going to close it in 10 seconds.
So again, a reminder, if you guys have any further questions or I didn't answer your question, you submitted one through the tab and I didn't do it properly, here's my contact information. I'll be happy to go into more detail on this stuff. I know I covered everything pretty quick.
Okay, here's the results. The commercials overwhelmingly took it over, but the Broncos are the leading team. So that what this tells me is that 31% of these poll answers are correct. So go Broncos. So thank you, Heather, for all your time, and I appreciate it. I'm sure everybody else did, and thank you guys for your time. I know we've gone a little bit over. I am going to get this webinar on our website as soon as possible and get you guys a link. So if you were unable to, if you came in late or if you'd like to share it, we can get that to you as soon as possible. Thank you guys again, and have a great day. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you.
See you.